Hey folks, this is a bit of a ramble here. I'm doing an Eberron primer. So as I said, I'm going to talk a bit about Eberron because there is a huge release on D&D Beyond. I believe it may be the largest release, official release I should say, since 5th edition D&D came out. Coming up here, and I'll pull it up on screen, we have this book right here, Rising from the Last War. It is already pre-ordered and ready to go. It releases on November 19th, so we are talking about Tuesday. On Tuesday, all of this official content will be out. This is I believe, something like a 300 plus page campaign setting for the world that many of us may know about and some of us may not know about, the world of Eberron. So as I kind of hinted to in a video earlier in the week, I said that I was going to try and get up some reviews and then do a little bit of a primer, a little bit of a talk through, just me rambling to you about Eberron because I'm really excited about this book coming out. But I want to finish the current campaign that I'm running with my group, which is in the Avernus, Descent into Baldur's Gate, I think it's called. Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. Once that's done, though, while I concurrently sort of behind the scenes and not really bringing it to my table, while I kind of work on my own world and my own 5th edition D&D setting, I think I may be running my players in Eberron. So why the excitement for Eberron overall? As I said, this is a massive release for Wizards of the Coast, especially given the official treatment, right? Because now these are things that, yes, DMs have the right to not use official material and make house rules and changes anyway, but when something is sort of officially out there, I now have a new class that's coming out called the Artificer that, unless I've got a good reason for it, I'm going to allow my players to use this in any subsequent campaign, So when you start getting this sort of official Watson material, it becomes kind of what would be considered like canon, right? So Eberron is something that I've played in a little bit during the release, which I believe was 3.5. So there's a couple of fascinating reasons that really spark my interest with Eberron. Number one is I haven't dabbled in it enough. I've never run Eberron. I've only played in it. So there's still a very heavy mystery and intrigue element to me. I've heard so much about it. I've read so much about it. It's been around since 3.5, so we're talking about a setting in a world that's 15, 20 years old at this point. So I know about the Warforged. I know about the Dragon Mark houses. I know about I think it's like shifters or something like this. There's another sort of race, kind of a cat-like people or something like that. I know about Sharn and the prevalence of the low-level magic and the street lamps that are always lit, through many cities. And I know about the flying ships, and I've seen the artwork and the pictures. And it's permeated beyond just Eberron. It's been throughout a lot of the D&D gaming space. And there are people that are fans of this world as much as, if not more than, Forgotten Realms. So this thing sort of getting the official treatment, kind of the once and for all. And when I was watching the D&D Beyond video where Todd Kenrick was talking with Jeremy Crawford, the Sage Advice guy, who I believe is one of the initial sort of developers and designers that has really talked a lot with Keith Baker, and I'll mention Keith in a little bit. It sounds like this is kind of their all in on this world and this setting. And even though we see sort of a subtitle of Rising from the Last War, I think what's happened is in the world of Eberron, the world has been, Eberron itself has been in this decades-long, I think I've read somewhere, 100-plus year war. And finally, the war is over. And the folk, the city, the place, so everything from the land itself to those living within it, have finally risen and are coming out of this war. And the current state of the world and the story that's happening with this book coming out on Tuesday here is basically, what does that look like? Imagine Fallout, the video game, Fallout 3, let's say. And as a result of the war, it created this sort of shell that kind of secured and sort of sheltered the world and created a vault setting. And the results of this book and where we are in the timeline and in this space is basically everyone opening up those vault doors from the first time and rising up to the surface to see what Eberron is, to see what it has become. Both how the people are affected, what cultures have changed, what creatures are now roaming the lands, what things are now lying in ruin, And I believe there's just so much to go from that, because if you just think about it, whether from a real world perspective or other D&D worlds or my own stories and campaigns I've run, when you have something that is a potentially 80 to 100 year war, there's a lot of consequence, right? There's a lot of casualty. There's a lot of effect on the world in many, many ways, atmospherically, magically, of course, when we're talking about a fictional setting, things, so on and so forth. And I think there's so much interest with, you have something that's a setting that's already so thoroughly fleshed out. It's been around, as I said, for 20 years. It has everything. It has its own style, its own flair, its own flavor. It has its own it runs the gamut of various, languages and classes and races and options and sort of house rule things, right? So ways of playing the game, like using those hero points to give it that very Indiana Jones pulp action, high heroics feel. It has so many things that, since it's come out 20 years ago, that separate it from and make it feel different than Forgotten Realms. Eberron has always had that, and I think that's why you have sort of that following to it, is because it is given the full extensive treatment as you would with a Greyhawk, with a Ravnica, with the Forgotten Realms, with a Calamar, whatever it may be. But if none of those are to your liking and to your taste, maybe Eberron is. And seeing this sort of new creation and this new, all the energy and time, and as was said in the video I watched, the better part of a year of these guys just chunking away at this thing of really trying to get it right. And the evidence of that is making it an official book. I think there's enough stuff that sounds good on paper through Unearthed Arcana and whatnot, as the Artificer was one of them. But now seeing that sort of transition from the Unearthed Arcana state into this actual book, it kind of just lets us know that they feel confident through playtesting and through other things that this thing is ready to go. So it's from a creative standpoint, I love the amount of options that the diversity and the uniqueness of this world can bring, but also it's comforting as a dungeon master to be able to sort of sit back and just trust that as official material, it's already sort of been run through the gamut of playtest. It's already been kind of poked through with the fine-tooth comb. This is a thing I talk about constantly, of course, right? In all of my reviews, is I am not going to, when this comes out, I'm going to give my review on it on Tuesday, if not, a day or two later after I really digest it and read it. And I don't have, I don't see any reason why I may not create some subsequent videos when my campaign maybe goes this direction, where I can kind of talk about just the ebb and flow and just how this content is working for me. But I have no doubts that within my review of it, I'm going to second guess the layout, design, and editing, or the second guess the artwork. And simply because as an official thing, it has WotC resources behind it. So having sort of just the grit and the meat that's there, the book craft of it all, and feeling like that's all prim and proper and done, I can now focus on, not the small minutia of, are things laid out well, and is the wording good, and was it edited well, and is there good artwork? I can really focus and delve into the content. And for that, that's kind of where this video is going. It's going to be very rambly. This video is just more of a primer. If you want to kind of invest your time and energy into watching this, that's also why the camera's a little bit different. It gives me a little more freedom to just kind of chat with you a little more and just talk, versus kind of having the official mechanical bits of all the moving parts of setting up cameras and running out of battery and so on. So if we kind of just delve into a little bit of Eberron, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a PDF, okay? Now, what I have is, if I gave you just a bit of history, a bit of backstory. So Eberron came out, give me a moment. I'm going to pull this up. And you can see what I mean is, yes, I'll probably edit this stuff to a certain extent, but some of it I want to keep sort of that talk through sort of environment, or that coffee talk feel. So here we have the Eberron Campaign Setting. The original, I think it's 3.5, right? So another really strong appeal to this setting for me is, and I mentioned this kind of in that video earlier where I said I was going to try and knock out some reviews. I am still going to do this the review on the new Monster Manual 2 Expanded that was sent to me. But I think I'm going to do that after the Eberron review of this new Rise of the Last War coming out. So it's coming up, but I really want to delve into some Eberron stuff right now. So number one, there's a fully fleshed out world that has sort of just inundated my gaming space, it's just been everywhere. I've seen Eberron for 20 years. But yet I've never delved into it enough, especially as a dungeon master. And because of that, I'm not tired of it yet. It's not like Forgotten Realms for me where I'm just done with that setting. I've been there and I've done that. There's so much fresh and new to me, yet it's a 20-year-old setting that has the multiple layers behind it. The other thing is I'm just fascinated with the idea of where this came from. So back in I think it was 2002, 2004, Wizards of the Coast put out a competition, kind of a call out to all these prospective designers and creative people out there that said, we're going to put a contest out of you to submit your own campaign setting. And whatever one we think is the best, we're going to put our resources and full official treatment behind it, and we're going to turn it into an actual world. And this was the winning submission by Keith Baker. And where it has gone from there, most people have said rightfully so, he deserved to win. I don't know what the sort of second place and the runner-up and third place submissions were, and I think you can find that through Google. But in here, we have something that rivals in depth, but most importantly, in its own unique flair and flavor to Forgotten Realms, right? It feels distinctly different, but yet it feels like it has just as much meat that you can chew on. So I'm just fascinated as a creative individual myself that something that can begin sort of from a homebrew perspective can reach this level of status. And that's always a fascinating thing for me. So I'm all in on Eberron right now. I'm really, really fascinated with it. So one thing is, I think the easiest way without chunking through 300 pages, especially since we're talking about an older edition, but this is the founder, the forefather, I guess, if you will. This is what began it all. Okay, so you can see it was James Wyatt, Keith Baker, folks like this, are 20 years ago. What's the date on this thing? It's a 3.5 revision. So when 3.5 was out, whatever it is, right? But this thing has been run through, first printing June of 2004. Many of these folk, Chris Perkins and whatnot, are still affiliated with D&D. So it's comforting also to know that the same people are involved in the one that's 20 years later. So you're not getting something different. You're just getting it brought into the current new rule set, which is just awesome and brilliant. So the easiest thing is to kind of talk a little bit through the table of contents without actually going to those sections, because that way I can ramble a little more and get into and start moving us and transitioning towards the current state of Eberron. So you've got the tone, you have the world. The simplest thing I can think about with the tone, and this is coming from someone that has played in it, and I've read through some stuff and I've prepared for this video, but I have not run extensive amounts of campaigns in this world myself, any campaigns for that matter. So I can't talk from a purely experience level, okay? The general tone of Eberron is it's very kind of pulp action, high heroics, okay? So Indiana Jones-ish, that type of thing. And it's very high. When I say high magic, the prevalence of very high level magic like resurrection and stuff is not there, but low level magic is everywhere. It permeates all of society, all the cities. It's all over the place. Okay, so low level magic, like in the city of Sharn, which is kind of like the New York City of, the main capital, if you will, of the entirety of the Eberron world and the setting, I think, has street lamps that are magically lit. So you have just the prevalence of that. You have folk that they don't have servants and commoners and common folk that are cleaning their house. You have this unseen servant aspect. Now, of course, because this was created during 3.5, the magic system and the spells were very different at that time, or at least many of them were different than what you see now in 5th edition. But you just have the prevalence of very low-level magic everywhere. Folk weren't necessarily starving because they could just create food and water. So that's a general tone of it. And then you combine that with a mechanical thing of creating something, I believe it's called hero points. So if I can see where that is over here. I think it's in here. I'm pretty sure that's not a new thing for 5th edition. And it is, because when I played it in 3.5. Hero points is basically, and I think the way it's going to transfer into the new current campaign setting coming up here on Tuesday, is you basically get like a D6 roll that you get to add on to your D20 rolls type of thing. And they just give you, imagine like a constant bardic inspiration or a constant bless. Not constant, because I believe you can spend those hero points. You get like 5 or a fixed amount at the beginning of each session type thing. But they give you the mechanical ability to be the Indiana Jones, right? To try and swing from your whip across a chasm of snakes, right? Without dropping your hat. So therefore, you're not just making an acrobatics check, you're making it with the addition or the ability to use these optional dice. But it creates the option and the opportunity for players to be a little more adventurous, to be a little more risky, because they have dice that can kind of help them get out of these sticky situations or do things that maybe their character might not otherwise be able to. And I believe the common thread between the tone of it and the overall feel of Eberron, the sort of low magic is everywhere and kind of creating this pulp atmosphere, combined with the mechanical bits like that, like using the hero points, it creates this sort of larger than life, really fun, entertaining world. But yet there's the full treatment of, the demon waiths, and I think there's another one, the Mournland, where you have areas that are entirely filled with just horrible, nasty things. So there can be a very dark, macabre horror element to some of your campaigns here, but yet you can still have that Indiana Jones, very smile on the face, entertaining aspect to it. As far as races, some of the big, most well-known things, here's the shifters I was talking about. You have the Kalashtar, you have your normal, your elves, dwarves, and whatnot. And again, I'm looking at the book, the 3.5 version, so we're kind of referencing off of a new world based on that rule set. Obviously now we've got the addition of certain, like where might furbolgs be or where might Goliaths be in this type of world and whether they exist. I don't think they do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up another sheet really quickly. And I'll kind of just talk through that, right? Let's forget about the Wayfinder's Guide. I'll explain that in a little bit. But you have changelings, you have the goblinoids, you have Kalashtar, orcs, shifters, warforged. You have all sorts of different races that are playable. And it's just showing the difference between what was in Rising from the Last War versus Wayfinder's Guide. So you have all these different race options and things like this. So Warforged is a big one. It's basically the creation of constructs. And when we move into the new version of it, so the one coming up here on Tuesday, what we have is we've got Warforged, which are think of constructs that were created as soldiers. Like they're created for the purpose of war. And they've existed and they were a necessity during a time of war. But 80, 90, 100 years removed after the war is over, they're still here. They come out from that vault, as I kind of use that analogy. And they come out and they're now still walking through the world. So what's their purpose? And I know that one of the really dark forces in this world is kind of the leader, I think the Lord of Blades, who kind of runs a sort of Warforged detachment, a company. They've sort of kept this violent nature of, these things are war. They're forged for war, and they're still here in the world that is now currently at peace, so to speak. The world is no longer at war, but yet you have things that are only forged for that purpose. It brings a lot of dynamics and, interest in that race in and of itself. And they've always been very well known. The Warforged are something that came about in the initial Eberron in 3.5, and I've known of people that have brought them into their own worlds. Like, hey, I'm making my own world, but I want to really use the Warforged from here, and I want to use the concept of Dark Elves and Drow and Menzo Baranzan, even though I'm not playing in Forgotten Realms. That sort of feeling. That's the impact that Eberron has had, especially with like the Warforged and whatnot. You have all the same classes, except you have the new Artificer. I'm really interested to see the treatment and how they handle the official aspects of that. Equipment is certainly a big thing because you've got the advent of certain technologies. Like gravity plays differently because you have the various planes of existence, and the way elementals and such interact with the world is different than what we might otherwise know in something like a Greyhawk or in a Forgotten Realms. So the prevalence of magic and the elements of air and fire and whatnot are very, very strange and different. The planes themselves can be very, very different, and just how it's handled. From what I understand, the plane of fire or the sea of fire is sort of its own entity, its own place. But it's not just the place where like hell and the forces of demons or devils or whatnot. It's in all of it. It's demons, it's devils, it's also celestials, because anything that has an element of fire to them, regardless of alignment, all lives in this place. So that's very different than what you might see in a Forgotten Realms. Also, when we're talking about alignment's a lot more ambiguous in Eberron. So is religion. There are clerics that are getting their power just based on how they live and how they go about their daily activities. And it's not just directly attached to some sort of a god or higher figure. So I love the handling of the Pantheon and kind of keeping it focused at more of the street level than much larger and bigger than that. So it's just a fascinating setting in a world. Yeah, there's those heroic action points that I was talking about. You then have the dragon marks, which are literally like tattoos that are exhibited on certain dragon marked families. And the families are sort of the names behind corporations, if you will. So various companies that are responsible for the way, the machinations of just life, as it moves throughout the world, through the various towns, cities, villages, what merchant guilds, who is responsible for the flying ships, and who's responsible for this level of magic and that level of magic. You have it behind it all are sort of these corporations known as the dragon mark houses, but there's a family associated to it. So again, it takes that larger big picture, overhanging government aspect, I guess, but it starts bringing it down to the family name, and only certain family members exhibit those dragon mark tattoos, which actually do give benefits and spell power and magical ability. But because you're bringing it down to the individual level, it brings it down to that street level once again. And it starts to create this sort of atmosphere of there's a lot of moving parts and a lot going on, but there's a lot for players to play in at a very low level. That aren't, you know how you get those campaigns where we're low enough level, we don't know the big global, we're not ready to shut down portals yet. We're not dealing with devils. We're not trying to take down and dragon hunt the ancient red dragon. We're never going to meet the gods for, another 10 to 15 levels. We're not trying to fix an entire world and a city. I don't commune with my, what I mean? It's a very simple level of we're just trying to eat and keep the goblins from stealing the 2 pigs that are in my village, right? It's a very kind of simple, basic lifestyle, and then it compounds on that. I love that there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of interest, a lot of interesting bits, and you have the hero points and all this other stuff, but it keeps things affiliated to and associated to that street level where you can feel and touch it. It doesn't feel like you're in a world where you're never going to meet the emperor of the kingdom, that type of thing. Forgotten Realms, I believe, because of the fatigue of it for me, kind of led into that too much. Like every campaign at some point sort of devolved into we meet Elminster. You know what I mean? And like, oh, well, we're not just meeting a random drow, we're going to meet Druids. You know what I mean? And we know the stories of the Icewind Dale trilogy and Mithril Hall and all this other stuff. And, oh, Clouth, we're not worried about those sort of things. You know what I mean? And we're meeting the Cymbrul or whatever her name was. And we're going into Candlekeep and all these other places. And the Harpers are like my buddies. And I have the ability, the evac. If I need to teleport out, I got it. Because NPCs, I like the very simple, I'm starving, I'm dying, there's goblins stealing our pigs. But yet, because it affiliates to maybe that one individual that has a dragon mark, that guy associates at a much higher level to the idea of a merchant guild, which moves further above at a much higher level into the idea of the entire family, this dragon marked house, which leads into the entire sort of corporation element. And now you realize that they're kind of responsible for everything that's happening within the entire region. So there's just a lot of interesting bits. I like the tone that they seem to be going with this Eberron book coming out. There's a bestiary in there. You've got all these new races. You've got, playable things, the new class, like I said. Of course, you can have all sorts of new and interesting equipment. And most importantly, and I'll kind of start to wrap it up here, I think the biggest excitement of all of it is it's official stuff. So I'm, again, confident that it's been run through the ringer and it's been play tested. And in that it's official, I just have the confidence that I can kind of twist and manipulate some things if it doesn't fit my table directly. But I like that I now have some new tools and some new equipment and some new weapon options that I can bring, even if I'm not playing in Eberron. Or I can now bring the Warforged in and say it's kind of like my version of an Iron Golem coming, as a playable class or a playable race. And I like the aspect of the official nature of I have a lot of things that I can pull from. And that's always sort of to a benefit as a creative individual and a dungeon master, because it allows me in the creation of my own stories, my own worlds. Again, if I'm not playing directly in Eberron, I'm always kind of boiling up that cauldron. And all I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to create the best meal for my players possible. And I don't know what ingredients I need to throw in. But sometimes I just need to add a little bit more to add a little bit more spice, or a little bit extra meat, or a little bit extra seafood, or whatever I might need if I'm making the world's best meal or the best stew. And I like here that it's now basically giving me an entire ingredient list that I can pull from to make that wondrous, wondrous meal. And on that note, I'm getting very hungry. So I'm going to end this video. It's kind of a very rambly one. No problems if you skipped ahead or you didn't watch any of this stuff. But that's sort of a little bit of a, more for me than anything else, of that's my excitement for Eberron. So stay tuned for, as I said, I am going to do that review on the new Monster Manual 2 that was sent to me. Thank you so much for sending that to me, Dragonix. And of course you will see the review on the official Eberron book that's coming out here in 2 to 3 days. Thanks everyone for watching, and take care.